Tonight, Scarlett Johansson is not here, and that absence feels intentional, because Scarlett Johansson has always been present without being accessible. She is seen constantly, but rarely known, and that difference defines her entire career. In an industry that confuses exposure with connection, Scarlett Johansson chose distance, not silence. Distance with boundaries. Now pause for a moment. Think about how often Scarlett Johansson speaks as herself. Not in a role, not in character, just her. It's rare, and rarity creates authority. Scarlett Johansson doesn't explain herself often. She doesn't perform relatability. She doesn't invite interpretation unnecessarily. She lets the work exist without commentary. And in a culture addicted to explanation, that restraint feels almost confrontational. Now let's talk about projection. Scarlett Johansson has been projected onto for most of her life. She didn't choose that. It arrived early. Roles framed her as mysterious, desirable, unreachable. The audience filled in the gaps. Projection thrives in silence, and Scarlett Johansson learned to live inside that silence without trying to correct it. Correction invites debate. Debate invites erosion. She avoided both. Now think about control again. Control doesn't always look dominant. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Refusal to over-explain. Refusal to overshare. Refusal to let every opinion become a response. Scarlett Johansson practices refusal quietly, and quiet refusal is powerful, because it doesn't ask for validation. Now consider fame. Fame usually demands accessibility. Smile more, share more, be more open. Scarlett Johansson did the opposite. She became more contained as her visibility increased. Containment protects identity. Without it, people lose their edges. Now think about identity. Scarlett Johansson has played a wide range of characters. Strong, detached, vulnerable, controlled. But her public persona barely changes. That consistency is not accidental. It's armor. Armor against misinterpretation. Because when you allow people to define you too freely, they eventually claim ownership. Scarlett Johansson never allowed that. Now let's talk about femininity. Her femininity has been discussed, analyzed, debated, often without her consent. She didn't lean into that conversation. She didn't reject it loudly either. She sidestepped it by refusing to center her identity around other people's expectations. That refusal reads as strength, not aggressive strength, contained strength, the kind that doesn't fluctuate based on reaction. Now think about silence again. Scarlett Johansson's silence is not absence, it's selectivity. She speaks when she chooses to, not when she's prompted. That difference matters, because speaking on demand turns identity into performance. She refused to perform herself. Now consider authority. Scarlett Johansson carries authority without dominance. She doesn't demand respect, she assumes it, and assumption, when backed by consistency, becomes reality. Now let's talk about tension. Tension exists between how she is perceived and who she actually is. She never resolves that tension publicly. She lets it exist. And unresolved tension keeps curiosity alive. Curiosity fuels longevity. Now think about the internet. The internet punishes ambiguity. It demands clarity, statements, positions. Scarlett Johansson resists that demand. She doesn't clarify herself to satisfy timelines. She lets complexity remain complex. That frustrates people, but frustration is better than erosion. Now here's the late-night irony. People often say Scarlett Johansson is distant, but distance is not coldness, it's boundary. Boundaries protect energy, and energy is what sustains careers. Most burn out from being emotionally available to strangers. Scarlett Johansson never made that mistake. Now think about longevity. Longevity doesn't come from visibility alone, it comes from preservation. Scarlett Johansson preserved herself by limiting access. She didn't disappear, she curated presence. Curated presence feels intentional. Intentionality feels powerful. Now consider pressure. Pressure usually forces people to become louder. Scarlett Johansson became quieter. Quieter people are harder to read. Harder to read means harder to reduce. Reduction destroys nuance. She protected nuance. Now think about control one more time. Control is not about dominating the narrative, it's about not being consumed by it. Scarlett Johansson stepped aside just enough to avoid being flattened by expectation. Now bring this back to you. Because this isn't just about Scarlett Johansson, it's about the cost of being visible without boundaries. About how easily identity gets absorbed by perception. Scarlett Johansson chose to remain partially unreadable, and unreadability became her strength. She didn't invite intimacy from strangers, she reserved it for the work. That separation is rare, and rarity creates respect. So tonight, this isn't about admiration, it's about recognizing a different kind of power. One that doesn't announce itself, one that doesn't explain itself, one that simply exists on its own terms. Scarlett Johansson built a career on being seen without being consumed, and in a culture that constantly asks for more, that restraint might be the most radical move of all. Now let's talk about fatigue. Because fatigue doesn't always come from working too much. Sometimes it comes from being watched too closely. Scarlett Johansson has lived under observation for most of her adult life. Not curiosity, surveillance, every gesture interpreted, every silence questioned, every choice turned into commentary. That kind of attention doesn't ask permission. It takes. And over time, being taken from creates distance. Scarlett Johansson didn't withdraw suddenly. She recalibrated. That recalibration wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Fewer explanations, less emotional access, more separation between work and self. Now think about exhaustion again. Exhaustion doesn't always look tired. Sometimes it looks controlled. It looks like choosing words carefully, like not engaging when provoked, like protecting energy instead of spending it. Scarlett Johansson learned that restraint was not optional, it was survival. Now let's talk about projection again. Projection is exhausting because it ignores reality. People don't see you, they see what they need you to be. Scarlett Johansson became a symbol early, not by choice. And symbols don't get complexity, they get flattened. She refused to flatten herself to fit the projection. That refusal cost her warmth in the public imagination, but it preserved her autonomy. Autonomy is expensive, but worth it. Now think about control again. Control is often mistaken for dominance, but Scarlett Johansson's control is defensive. It's about protecting interior space. Without interior space, identity dissolves. She protected that space by limiting emotional exposure. Now let's talk about misunderstanding. Scarlett Johansson is often described as reserved, but reserve is not emptiness, it's discernment. She doesn't offer herself to every conversation, she chooses. Choice restores power to the person being observed. Without choice, visibility becomes extraction. Now, consider conflict. Public conflict demands reaction, apologies, clarifications, performative accountability. Scarlett Johansson resisted that cycle, not because she didn't care, but because constant reaction reduces people to moments. Moments are easy to judge, lives are not. She chose to be more than a moment. Now let's talk about longevity. Longevity doesn't come from pleasing everyone. It comes from staying intact. Scarlett Johansson stayed intact by refusing to live entirely online. She didn't let the internet define her emotional tempo. That separation allowed her to keep working without burning out. Now think about authority again. Authority is quiet. It doesn't argue constantly. It doesn't chase approval. Scarlett Johansson's authority comes from consistency. She shows up prepared. She delivers. Then she leaves. No spectacle, just reliability. Reliability is underrated because it's not loud, but reliability builds trust. Trust builds careers. Now let's talk about femininity again. Scarlett Johansson's femininity has been framed by others for decades. She didn't reclaim it loudly, she normalized it privately. She refused to perform femininity to correct misconceptions. Correction invites endless debate. She opted out of debate. That opt-out felt frustrating to some, but frustration is lighter than surrender. Now think about silence again. Silence from Scarlett Johansson is often interpreted as distance, but silence can be clarity. Clarity about what deserves response. She doesn't treat every question as worthy of her interior life. That boundary keeps her grounded. Now consider time. Time rewards restraint. What looks cold early often looks wise later. Scarlett Johansson's choices aged well, because they weren't reactive, they were measured. Measurement creates durability. Durability outlasts attention cycles. Now think about the cost of being readable. Readability invites consumption. If people think they understand you, they feel entitled to you. Scarlett Johansson never allowed complete readability. She remained partially opaque. Opacity protects humanity. Now let's talk about agency. Agency is choosing how you are perceived. Scarlett Johansson didn't try to control perception completely. She limited its reach. Limiting reach is smarter than fighting interpretation. Interpretation never stops, but access can. Now here's the late-night irony. People often mistake openness for authenticity, but authenticity doesn't require exposure. It requires alignment. Scarlett Johansson aligned her public presence with her capacity. She didn't exceed herself. She didn't collapse under expectation. She stayed within limits. Limits preserved her. Now bring this back to modern culture. We live in a time where visibility is currency, where silence feels like absence, where boundaries are seen as rejection. Scarlett Johansson challenges that logic without speeches. Her career is the argument. She remained relevant without emotional availability. She stayed powerful without constant explanation. She lasted by not giving everything away. Now think about power again. Power isn't always expansion. Sometimes it's contraction, pulling back, reducing access, choosing where energy goes. Scarlett Johansson practiced contraction in a culture obsessed with growth. That choice protected her identity. Now here's the final late-night thought. Scarlett Johansson didn't become distant because she lacked feeling. She became selective because feeling was being exploited. And in a world that consumes emotion endlessly, selectivity is not selfish, it's survival. She showed that you can be seen without being owned, that you can be admired without being available, that you can succeed without turning yourself into public property. Scarlett Johansson built a career on being visible but not penetrable. And that balance might be the quietest and strongest form of power we have left.